On this episode of the show, I have with me Jordan Tigani. He is the CEO and co-founder of MotherDuck, and we're going to be talking about the infrastructure space being a different area to operate in than typical SaaS products. And we'll ask Jordan how they're different business models, different ways of potentially raising venture capital. Jordan also spent a lot of time building the BigQuery product, and we'll talk about how that experience carried over to MotherDuck and some other things, also competing with infrastructure players that are a little bit bigger in legacy in the enterprise space. Try to fit in as much as we can with you, Jordan. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Amir. Great to be here.
Absolutely. Before we start, can you tell everyone what the company does?
Yes. So MotherDuck, we're building a data warehouse, cloud SaaS data warehouse based on DuckDB, which is an open source analytics engine.
All right. I'm sure that's a whole episode in and of itself. This one, we're going to talk a little bit about this infrastructure space, obviously. Lots of people who compete in the SaaS space don't quite maybe see some of the challenges, or there are some similarities, and we'll let you highlight those. But what are some of the differences? If you're a startup in the infrastructure space, what are some challenges that you run into that maybe non-infrastructure SaaS companies don't?
I think one of them is that it takes a lot longer to build infrastructure than it does to build, a lot of other typical SaaS products. And sometimes that can be a little bit frustrating. And sometimes people are like, "Oh, why is this taking so long?" You can generally, for a lot of things, you can put together a website, a service that solves a problem for people, and get it running very quickly. But if you're really building infrastructure, and if you're actually creating value added infrastructure, there's sort of no shallow way to do it. There's no way to just sort of say, "Hey, I'm gonna hack for a couple of weeks and then get something up and running and start to sell it to people." First of all, just the expectations of reliability and robustness in the infrastructure market are very high. People, it's sort of at the things that are at the bottom of the stack are things that just have to work and are just expected to work. But the other thing is that there's no shortcuts there's very few shortcuts to making something really work and really works well in infrastructure. And that surprises people. I think that, people are like, "Oh, why can't I just, take these two components that already exist, or these great open source projects, I'm going to string them together and launch those as a SaaS infra product." I think if you really want to actually build something interesting, you can't just sort of string existing components together. You actually have to contribute meaningfully to improving the state of the art. And it just, I know it just seems like, "Oh, it's different, it's surprising," but I don't want to name names of companies because that makes me kind of an asshole. But I talk to a lot of founders, and people say, "Hey, I'm taking this thing and then I'm connecting it to this thing," and it's like, that sounds great, but kind of if you really want to build an infrastructure product, you kind of have to go deeper.
And obviously, yeah, we'll kind of dive into that. And I guess before we dive into that, out of curiosity, when you guys are a startup, when you go raise venture capital, is there any difference? Obviously, you mentioned, and the reason I'm asking is you mentioned, obviously there is a little bit of a longer process when you're building for that enterprise, especially infrastructure. But is the venture capital side any similar, any different?
I think there's certainly VCs that are happy funding infrastructure. I think sometimes there are VCs that don't always get sort of how infra and sort of more typical SaaS are different, and sometimes they, as a founder, those can be difficult. You sort of have to watch out for that because they expect things to move at a different timeline. I think, for example, one of the still remaining the best ways of doing an infrastructure startup is starting with open source, because then at least you can sort of have the time and you can get funding based on kind of open source adoption or open source excitement. Um, but the other thing is just in general the amount of money that you need to raise to build infra is tends to be higher. Sort of if it's going to take longer and um, and with require more people, then um, you just have to have a it's more takes more money, and b the investors need to be perhaps a little bit more patient.
Absolutely. That makes complete sense. And obviously, we'd love to talk a little bit about the enterprise space and the level of product you need before you are actually able to go talk to the companies you're looking for, the companies you're targeting with infrastructure. I guess when you look at the MVP and you look at looking for product market fit, if you're a SaaS company, if I talk to enough founders, you try to find some design partners, you get them involved, you get them in the loop, you talk to them, take that feedback, iterate, blah blah blah, standard conversation. I feel that's pretty common. If you are building, obviously for the enterprise infrastructure space in general, there is a notion of reliability that comes in. People don't like to use infrastructure that's unreliable. How does that relationship of looking for product market fit, getting your MVP up, and having to deal with an infrastructure product, how do those dynamics play out?
I think in general, I mean, either you find an enterprise company that really is going to bet on you, and bet on you with generally like either writing a big check or saying that they're gonna commit. I think that can be very, very hard unless you have some sort of special in, or you end up selling to startup companies. And I think startup companies themselves are all looking for their own angle of like, hey, how do we do this faster, better, cheaper? They're a lot more comfortable being on the bleeding edge of technology. They don't have, typically millions of users that have to sort of keep happy, and they're generally more willing to work with you as you are, as you're building things. They also have, the barrier to entry from the kind of security, and enterprise checkbox perspective is a lot lower. And so, kind of as a startup building something, you're trying to prove that this is useful, and you're trying to prove that this works. If you spend all your time building kind of infrastructure security features, which eventually, which are important and eventually you're going to have to do, but if you have, say you have 5 engineers, if three of those are working on this custom auth thing to get some giant customer to work with you, then like those are 3 engineers that are spent on kind of really undifferentiated features, and you'd be better off spending the time with building the thing that actually makes your product amazing. And um, and I think to do that, the kinds of companies that you're going to be able to target are going to be typically smaller. I think there's kind of always this the life cycle curve where you start with the tech forward people, and then sort of the early adopters and the early majority, and they're crossing the chasm and all that, and starting with really finding good product market fit among startups who are typically your peers. They're also easier to get to, easier to get people who get excited about technology and not necessarily about ROI, business value. You have to have ROI and business value. That's also absolutely not something that you can like say, hey, we're just going to build some really cool tech. I mean, I think that's actually one of the biggest missteps that particularly like people building infra and kind of really which tends to be more interesting technologies. They focus on the technology and not making sure that it's actually a business, or not the marketing and the kind of all the pieces that have to come together that if you want to make it real. And I think that's even more so perhaps than in the infra space, where it's going to take you a little while to get to the full vision of what you're going to build. So you kind of have to start by building your community, building the excitement kind of as you go. Um, and and less of like, hey, here's a finished product, or here's something that is going to amazingly solve this big problem you have. You kind of you need to sort of build some of these muscles at different times than in other SaaS companies.
Absolutely. And obviously, I mean, you early in your career, you spent time at Google building BigQuery. So you have seen scale that maybe others have not seen. And taking that into a startup, similar infrastructure type product, obviously smaller, scale is not the same, but you have a lot to pull from. And I'm sometimes curious when you see somebody who has that background that has a solid understanding of what that scale looks like, and then they're trying to build their own product at a, obviously as big as you can grow it. I mean, we don't know where that'll be, but there's a lot to pull on. And I guess always the concern is, and obviously the benefit is, what do you pull on? When do you pull on it? Because there are different stages, different life cycles. And I'm always curious to hear thoughts on, taking that experience and bringing it to MotherDuck. What do you try to carry over? What do you try to actually avoid bringing over? What are your thoughts there?
So it was very interesting to be at Google working on BigQuery, and then I took another couple of years and I worked at SingleStore, which was a late stage startup, and kind of that tension and the dichotomy between those two was very, very instructive. I think more so than either one of those would have been on their own. I mean, certainly at Google, there are things you get for free at Google, like awareness. Everybody kind of knows about Google, and you kind of have a built-in audience for anything that you do, and it's easy to take for granted how much that you have, and or how much people actually are going to care. Working at a late stage startup, it was like, wow, nobody cares unless you like really, really hook them. Marketing is war, and it's war for eyeballs, and it's war for, and you really have to like hone your message. And, a lot of the times in BigQuery, we thought we were doing great. And it was just, we had this sort of like juggernaut behind us. It also gave us the space to build, iterate. The early days of BigQuery it was pretty raw. It was, kind of, it's easy to look back, or it's easy to like look at what it is now and all the things it can do and how smooth things are and how things tend to just work, and to sort of realize that, for many years we didn't have a lot of things that seem relatively basic. And I think actually one of the lessons that I learned was that you can actually, if you give people something compelling enough, you can have some things that aren't what they expect, or aren't ideal, because you kind of have, if you kind of depart from the norm of expectations a little bit, that can allow you to explore more interesting technological like areas. And then with kind of more time and energy, you can sort of circle back around. But if you're not, I think, if you're not willing to sort of do things differently, then all you're going to do is sort of end up chasing the incumbents. And, at the end of the day, they're well ahead of you. So you're going to have a really hard time catching up. Certainly we did see scale, and so I think, the other lesson was just sort of like, hey, you can get to pretty big scale with some, some stuff is going to be missing. Now, of course, it's many years later now, and so the table stakes have gotten significantly higher, and people expect there's more things that people are going to expect, and that's just the name of the game. But I think we were pretty committed in BigQuery to, is like, hey, we're building something that we believe is an amazing service, an amazing piece of software, and that is very useful to people. and it looks different than Teradata. I mean, that would, and that should look different than Teradata. And this, we're trying to do the same thing in MotherDuck. Is like, hey, it's going to look different than Snowflake, and if it looks just like Snowflake, then why would you use it over Snowflake? And some of those things are going to be great, and some of them are going to be like, well, that's weird. We just have to smooth over the weirdness. Weirdness is over time.
Absolutely. That was a great explanation. And I guess when you're looking at MotherDuck and you're trying to, I guess, make sure that you're bringing the right processes, bringing the right mindset. You obviously mentioned you worked at Google, SingleStore, late stage startup. So different perspectives in terms of just engineering principles and how things are done, levels of resources available. When you think about the engineering culture and what you're trying to instill, obviously you're still a startup, but you're competing in the space that is with all these enterprise players, and you do have to potentially sometimes look and walk a little. I was going to make a duck joke and I kind of lost it, but it was almost there. You could hear it, but on another day I'd get that nailed on. But you do have to look the part a little bit, but not overpromise. I find it's like a very art and science balance that you probably are dealing with because of the dynamics in the space you're competing against. Am I reading that right, or is there? Yeah, maybe I'm completely wrong, but I'd love to see your thoughts there.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of like the engineering, building the engineering, like one thing that we did in BigQuery that I thought was really that I always wanted to take that with me, and was it was a very bottoms up kind of engineering culture. It's sort of like engineers with ideas could get stuff done, and I think that's like the old school Google was very much like that. In BigQuery, actually, we were asked to build something different. We were actually asked to build a data marketplace, and we said, okay, well, data marketplace, we'll get there eventually, but first you need something to do with the data, and so we built BigQuery. And we never got around to the data marketplace, which I thought was sort of funny. It was literally one quarter away for 10 years. Um, but we had, engineers that were very in tune with what customers were doing, what the customer problems we were solving, what the, where we wanted to go. And so, people could build, and they could build very fast, so they could build very independently, and confidently. And we ended up, with what I thought was a great place to work and be an engineer, and also build some pretty compelling things. Because I think, especially if you're trying to be too top down, it's very hard to be really close to the threshold of what's possible. And the people that are in the weeds, kind of every day, dealing with like, okay, hey, we could make this a little bit faster. We could make this better. We could, people are asking for this, but we have this other thing around, and we could just connect these two things. And like, those kinds of decisions can't be made, top down. Those can be made bottom up. The other thing though, as a, in Google, you have kind of the benefit of like, yeah, well, if this doesn't work out, I'll switch teams, and, I'll work on something very similar and similar technologies, and like, my salary is not going to be impacted, and my vesting is not going to be impacted. At a startup, it's literal life and death. And so like, there's also very much a tendency to be like, okay, well, top down, be like, hey, this is what we're doing, or this is where we're going. And I think the way to merge those is, you basically, as a leader, try to make sure that everybody has a model in their head of A, what you're doing and where you're going, B, who are your customers, what do customers want, what are the customer needs. Try to remove the levels of interaction between engineers and customers. And to some engineers, that's terrifying to actually talk to customers, and like some companies, or sometimes it's terrifying to have certain engineers talking to certain customers, because it's not that you don't want to be honest with your customers, it's just you don't want to be like brutally honest. Sometimes can be is there's saying things the right way. But on the other hand, like there's just a lot of value in getting the engineering team deeply on, to understand like the customer issues and the business issues as well. Like, um, if you have creative people coming up with creative solutions, like you kind of want them to know the extent of the constraints. And if they don't know the business constraints, then, I think, then they're not going to be building, if they're going to be a headwind for building a great business versus a tailwind.
Absolutely. I like that. Um, as you were talking about this, I was thinking about your experience at BigQuery. You were at SingleStore as well, and when if you were to think back to what's that? I was just looking at my 2022. The company was founded. Um, what was it in the market that you saw that there was a gap to address with MotherDuck? I'm always interested in founders and how they kind of observe the market and how they come to that conclusion. But what was it that was like, hey, you know what? I think this product is the product we should build, and we're obviously I'm the right person. Well, your background probably makes you the right person, but love to hear what you saw. What gap was it you saw that you wanted to exploit?
Um, when I was at SingleStore, we were getting pressure like to scale down as well as up. And everybody had been talking about scale up, scale up, scale up, bigger, bigger, bigger scale, big data. I have huge data. The amount of data is exponentially increasing. But what we were hearing was we want a smaller version. We want a version that will go in a car. We want a version that will go, it'll be serverless and spin up just when we need it and shut down when it's not needed. And like if you think about the way the infrastructure was built for these distributed databases, these distributed analytical databases like BigQuery, Snowflake, Redshift, etc. They don't scale down very nicely because they have all of these like pieces and all these moving parts. And as you scale them down, there's all this fixed overhead. There's like this tax of like all this coordination that has to happen. And I saw this database, DuckDB, which is an embedded database, which means it literally can run in a car, or can run in a phone, it can run in any just about anywhere. And I'm like, hey, wow, this could scale down really, really nicely, as well as scale up, because these days machines are huge. Like MotherDuck, we just launched an instance that runs on an EC2 machine, on Amazon, that has 192 cores and a terabyte and a half of RAM. Like that is a lot of hardware to bring to bear to any problem, and there's very, very few workloads that won't run in that amount of hardware. And so it's like the constraints under which we built BigQuery and Snowflake was built and Redshift, et cetera, like they've changed. Like, it was like we were living in a world where, hey, if you needed more than a couple of gigabytes and you needed more than a couple of cores, you had to run on multiple machines and you had to pay the tax of all the coordination and overhead. And like, in BigQuery, for example, queries by default run on, 2,000 nodes. So that means every single query hits the 99.9 percentile, worst latency in whatever your storage subsystem is or your network. Bigger queries will run in like of a large scale query can run in, every single query hits the like 5 nines latency. Like it's just very, very hard to build something that is like performant in a world like that. And you deal with, okay, all sorts of failures and all sorts of like things that make your life a lot harder. Versus in a scale up system, you can do things at much lower latency. You can actually provide a better experience to people. So it's not just about like, hey, this is new tech. It's like you can provide a better experience because you can do lower latency, you can do lower cost, you can do all sorts of interesting things with tenancy. And so anyway, I thought like, hey, DuckDB is awesome. It can do these things. It can scale down. It can scale up really nicely. We can push workloads to the client. We can do all of these sort of interesting things. Somebody should really build build a SaaS service to run this in the cloud. And I thought like, hey, I've built 2 analytics SaaS services. Maybe that should be me. and and then I actually ended up, I asked the DuckDB founders if they would be willing to hire me to help build a SaaS service. And they said, well, we don't really want to build a SaaS service. We kind of want to focus on the database, but we'd love to partner with you. And so we've had this very, very close partnership with the creators of DuckDB. And that's been a great collaboration, from day one.
Absolutely. I love it. And maybe just, I think one or two questions, just to, maybe actually a final question here, given the time. When you're thinking about the product, where you'd like to see it go, its scale, I guess how far out do you start looking at those things? How I not total addressable market, that's different, but from an organizational perspective, like what are the goals that would make you happy? Like where does MotherDuck get? And obviously, knowing that you've been a part of BigQuery, you know what mass adoption and massive global scale looks like. But do you need that at MotherDuck to consider the product a success? You're obviously also addressing a different part of the market, which might mean that some of those things are just not even in scope. Maybe they are. I don't know. I'll let you answer.
Well, I think long term, like there's nothing that we did in BigQuery or that BigQuery can do that I don't think we're going to be able to do at MotherDuck. So I really think that the TAM, the overall TAM, eventually is synonymous. And in the short term, we are targeting sort of smaller scale workloads because you're going to want to have a beachhead. But there's nothing intrinsic about what we're doing that is sort of just sort of small data or just small use cases. One of the tricky parts actually is convincing people that what we're doing is going to scale, and I think that's probably going to be one of the big focuses in probably the next 18 months. Is like, how do we demonstrate that this works at scale? And sometimes that may mean redefining what people mean by scale. If you think of, I've got 100 users all running concurrent queries on one giant Snowflake instance. What if you have those 100 users all each had their own separate DuckDB instance that was auto scaling and auto shutdown, et cetera, running in the cloud. It's just a different shape. It's a different shape, but it's the same scale and it's the same computational problem. We can deliver that a lot less expensively and probably much lower latency. Or at least that's the premise under which we are operating. And so, we'll see. There's the analytics, the data warehouse market is huge and it's growing, and it's not winner take all. So there's room for multiple players, which is one of the exciting things.
I love that. I love the perspective because I feel like sometimes founders do get focused on some of the metrics that tend to be more vanity based versus actual building the org. So I thought that was fantastic. And I guess, well, maybe final question. I lied. This is the last question though. When you actually look at that component of trying to convince and talk about scale, when you're going to go to market, and the reason I'm asking this one is because I think founders, if they're listening, sometimes if they haven't been at different companies, kind of like you, see how products are differently positioned. I think sometimes this is hard, but when you're going to the market and you're trying to convince them of scale, what are you needing to do to accomplish that? I mean, obviously you need some examples. We know that. Are you focused on building white papers? Are you focused on testimonials? A little bit more tactical question, but I think sometimes if you're early stage career and you're a founder, some of these things are a little bit more difficult than it seems.
I think there's a hierarchy. The best is obviously where you have customers that look just like the other customer, the next customer that you want, that can vouch for, like, hey, this solved my problem and it worked at this scale, and this is even bigger scale than you have or that you are going to have. So that's sort of the gold. That's the gold standard. That's what you'd love to get. Then there's data. Then there's being able to say, hey, look, we have this data that shows that we can scale. We have these benchmarks. Those are useful, but you can always, benchmarks are should always be taken with a grain of salt. You can always show a good benchmark for something, and and then what really matters is like, it's not just how this does in a benchmark, but how does it work on my data? Um, and then, then I think the next is, you have to get good at implementation, and like, because people are going to want to poke the tires and try something out, and can you help them do the scale testing that you need, and make sure that that you're going to be able to handle that. And then I think the sort of the cheapest one, the lowest one is like, hey, is where you just say like, look, we're gonna scale, or we can scale, and you know, um, you use what you have. Ideally, if you have testimonials, you use that. If you have benchmarks, you use that. And if you have implementation accelerators, you use that. And otherwise, you just use your good word of saying yes, we can do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's fact. I mean, early on, you do have to use what you have at your disposal and find a way through. I mean, that's really a great way of viewing it. Jordan, thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing. Lots of exciting things happening there at MotherDuck. We might have to do a part 2 down the road and see how things have changed for you guys. But if somebody does have a question, it could be product related, it could be a question for you particular to the episode. What is a good way of touching base with you?
Yes, feel free to find me on LinkedIn. Happy to connect and chat about things. If I love talking about data, data companies. I love talking to founders and helping founders who are just getting started. Because there's no manual. Many times I wish there was, but several founders helped me when I got started, and they just said, this help is on the condition that you pay it forward. So I try to pay it forward when I can.
Wonderful. Jordan, thanks again for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, 2 things. One, I think talking about how MotherDuck came about, some of the issues that are specific to the infrastructure space. Jordan obviously has a fantastic background working for different size companies, seeing different type scale, and how he's applying that. Some great advice in there for founders who might be trying to do similar in this space, or even actually a little bit outside of the space. I think a lot of that advice applied to different founders at different type of industries and companies. So please share this episode with somebody else who might benefit from it. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.